Okay, good evening, everyone. We are recording this for our chapter YouTube channel, so that'll be posted later on this evening or tomorrow morning at the latest. So if you really like the presentation, want to share it with a peer or colleague, if there's a blooper from tonight up on stage that you want to rewatch, that should be available here shortly. Thank you, everyone. Our near 30 people here in the restaurant. We're great to see you. Normally our August meeting is on summer break, but with the pandemic, we want to try to deliver as many opportunities for PDUs and enlightenment as we can. So we're happy to see everyone on Zoom and here on the screen. Our project management symposium that we partnered with NCI was a great success. That was on the 14th of July. We had peak virtual attendance of 547. We had around 590 registered before the event. So it was great to see everyone join, and the people who joined in the morning were still, we were at the 84% for when we wrapped up in the afternoon. Spoke to a few members who participated and great feedback. I think that shows the power of virtual symposiums, and all those the video presentations are on our YouTube channel, and the presentation files themselves are on the website. So if you missed one, or if you got out of a lot of one of them or a few of them, you can go back and re-experience that. The PDU batch file has been sent to PMI, so you should be seeing the 7 PDU soon. And yep. Okay, all our chapter board members are still alive and well, many of which are on Zoom today, and our leadership tank is on the other side. Speaking of our board, our upcoming elections are looking at ballots in early November, which will be emailed from PMI's election hub at the PMI.org end of the deal. From a nomination perspective, we recommend that you nominate yourself. We've had people nominate other people that weren't interested in running, and so if you would like to be a part of the value that the board delivers to our members, Mr. Geis believes thoroughly in our motto that we're all about the members. Then consider throwing your name out there. Our 4 positions are for the president, where you must have prior chapter officer experience, our co-vice president of programs to help get the great speakers and the diverse speaker community that we get, our vice president of membership, and our vice president of communications. So stay tuned to newsletters on that, more to come. All right, for everyone in the restaurant, you realize this. For those virtually, we've returned back to in-person offerings. We're one of the 5 local chapters. We're the first, and they're taking our feedback and are excited that we're getting the turnouts that we are with the positive feedback. Our November member appreciation dinner will be free for all valid members. For those longtime members, that's our filet mignon crab cake meal. County Executive Elric hasn't come out with any guidance regarding indoor dining yet, so we'll adapt to whatever guidance comes out. But as of right now, we're still on schedule for the rest of the year. The first Wednesday of the month, we'll have an in-person meeting with a virtual option. So, when you, yes, ma'am. That's a good recommendation. So we'll see how things go. But in prior years, we've rented out the whole Normandie Farm restaurant in Potomac and had every room and been 350 deep. So we look forward to the second half of the year programming. PMIWDC's done something new. They're holding the first National Capital Region Symposium. So this will be PMIWDC facilitated and managed, but open to the 4 sister chapters. So ourselves, Baltimore, Silver Spring, and Southern Maryland. There will be a fee with that, but it'll be available at the member price if you're a valid member of our chapter. And for those who participate, we can work with you for potential value reimbursement. So that symposium is going to be held on Wednesday and Thursday, the 22nd and 23rd from 9 to 3:30, 7 PDUs each day, total of 14. So stay tuned for that. Right now, they haven't opened up registration, but when they do, you'll be one of the first to know. From a PMI Global perspective, there started a virtual experience series last year that there was a few $100 cost for that for members. For October, they're offering that for free. So that'll be held on October 6th and 7th, a Wednesday and Thursday. October 6th from noon to 6 p.m. And then for the people who don't have time during the day, but are up in the middle of the night, they'll have midnight to 6 a.m. So this is something new that they're trying just to hit both collections of talent. They don't necessarily look for people who want to get some sleep and work during the day. But and keynote speakers so far announced are the 2020 Kid of the Year from Time Magazine, as well as a best-selling author of a professional development book. And they'll fill out the schedule for the rest of the day. Seminars World is also a virtual PMI global offering. The next one will be the 11th through the 14th of October. Speakers include a few friends of our chapter, Dr. Martins, who spoke at our symposium a few weeks ago. He'll be speaking on influence on projects. Our friends with leadership techniques, Lisa and David, they'll be talking about maintaining flexibility to ensure project management success, and Mr. Bruce Gay on design thinking. Our education partners are still doing great things virtually. A few of them have gone back to socially distant, face-to-face engagement. I think we've learned over the past year and a half that some of us learn better when there's that direct engagement in person versus watching on a computer screen. So we're slowly getting back to that cautiously. So they're still all doing great offerings. And for those who have a company education and training allowance, or you can spend $1,000, $2,000 a year, these are great ways to use that money to further your professional acumen. We have 2 attendees, chapter members of the restaurant that have job offerings. So I'll bring them up back.
Hi, I'm Dr. Cheryl Lohman, and I'm the CEO and founder of Medaptic, which is an Internet of Medical Things company. I am a PMI, and I'm looking for a couple of different project managers. I'm hoping to bring in a $1.5 million NSF grant, phase 2, to follow up the phase 1 we just completed. If we get that, the monies will be coming in sometime next year. I'll be looking for a project manager to manage 2 software folks that will be developing software for the healthcare environment, moving into Epic and Cerner, as well as blockchain applications. So Solidity would be good to know for that. And then the other is somebody for manufacturing, a product that's about this big and probably will need to be manufactured via an injection mold. So looking for those people, trying to stay ahead of the curve. So let me know if you're interested.
Quick handoff to the next one. Stephen Reckford with GRSI, a small business located in Montgomery County. We have just won 3 contracts at NIH in the help desk operations space. So a good company, and obviously the government thinks so because they keep giving us awards. We've literally gotten a billion worth of awards in the first half of this year alone. Yeah. Needless to say, we are hiring project managers and program managers. Stephen Reckford, R-E-C-K-F-O-R-D. You can connect to me on LinkedIn. You can stop by and see me here. Love to hear about you if you're a project manager and you're looking for work.
Okay, and for both our in-person and virtual attendees, we'll get a quick 2-sentence elevator recap of that and share it out with everyone. Great opportunities, even in a pandemic. A lot of our chapter members are finding new employment and new roles. So it's always good to keep your options open. Okay, so our speaker for this evening is an internationally known crime genius who's rivaled Austin Powers for decades. He was a spokesperson for Six Flags in the 90s and 2000s and is one of TV Guide's greatest cartoon characters of all time. So it's weird to introduce yourself. So I'm Matt Lowy. I'm currently your chapter vice president of communications. I have a lot of letters after my name, which may have drawn a few people here virtually. I think the people in person came for the popovers and the crab stuffed cod. Yep. So it's good to have the support. So the past 3 or 4 months, I think since we came back in May, we've been publicizing that the 7th edition of the PMBoK was drawing near and was going to be released on August 1st. That was this past Sunday. It actually was available to members for download a few weeks early. So why am I up here? There's 10 pages of thank you for contributors in the PMBoK 7th edition. I'm not on that list. They didn't make a typo. I didn't help them. In terms of the friends of our chapter, Mr. Carl Pritchard, who spoke at our symposium, he's one of our longest tenured speakers in the 16-year history of our chapter, did contribute to the risk narrative in the PMBoK. There's not a risk management section as in prior years. It's weaved in. So he's our chapter's closest contributor. I, however, did review all 370 pages. So don't look at me as an official source, but look at me as your cliff notes. I looked over 370 pages. You just have to look over 24 slides and listen for 45 minutes or play with your phone. So, so from a showing of, yeah. So from a showing of hands, the 6th edition was released in 2017. If you didn't have to take a test based on the 6th edition of the PMBoK, how many people actually downloaded it and reviewed it to see what was in it? Show of hands and then yes, no's via chat. This the one in 2017. Okay, great. So about a quarter of the audience in person and on Zoom. Looks about split. Yeah. Okay, so back in 2017, the world was a little different. We wore masks on Halloween or if our job required it, not every day. A Marvel movie was leading the domestic box office in the summer. That's still the case 4 years later. And only 65,000 companies worldwide were using Zoom. That number is up to 467,000 companies today. So I didn't know what Zoom was until March of 2020, and I'm sure some of my fellow chapter members are in that same state. Okay, so the first project management standard came out in 1987. That's a 34-year-old standard overall. There's been updates to the edition, but before 1987, construction projects were completed, cities were built, IT, even if it wasn't in its robust nature that is in the 21st century. There was IT back in the mid 80s that you'd buy at Radio Shack and things of that nature. And those systems were completed by projects without PMI saying, this is how you do it. Since the 34 years since, however, when PMI did become a helping hand for project management and how project management could be most effective via a documented process, there's been three consistent business process functions. First, that it could be documented. A lot of pundits of PMI think that PMI is too document heavy and we've lost track of how to actually run projects. I think when you hear about the 7th edition, when you look at it yourself, you'll see that that's been course corrected to some extent. That performance against process can be assessed. So you can have that true baseline. That's been consistent through the 34 years. And the improvements to the process can be made to maximize efficiency and minimize threats. So you're maximizing the value and reducing the risk through whichever process you're using. Okay, since then, are we still in that same PMBoK heavy, what do I do world? Agile project management's changed a lot of that. PMI's kept up through their Agile Certified Practitioner, the ACP curriculum. They just came out with the Disciplined Agile, which Leadership Techniques is briefed on both at the symposium and at a dinner meeting. I think PMI came out with Disciplined Agile more to compete with Scrum Alliance and the Certified Scrum Master and those certifications. It seems like, at least from my perspective, and again, this is Cliff Notes, I did little interpretation on the slides, but my voice track may have some, but the majority are screenshots actually pulled from the 7th edition. But what I'm seeing is a trend where everything's becoming a project, and you've lost that a task is now a small project. And so if everything's a project, can we still operate in that deliverable process-minded environment? Is there time? And then is anyone reading your documentation? Like I've written probably in the past 10 years, a couple hundred pages of management plans, stakeholder plans, and I can count on probably hands and feet the people who actually like read them and gave me feedback. But that euphoria when you do write a document and you're like, yes, it's done. Like that's nice, it's fun to have, but is there value in it? Is it worth the time to write all this on paper if no one's going to read it? Any thoughts from those in the audience?
Yeah, you just need to change it to a YouTube video.
Yeah. So chapter member recommended that if we change it to a YouTube video, right now learning is very visual, and the younger generation is instead of reading or listening to a lecture, they're, oh, I'll just watch a YouTube video. On this very topic, there's because I don't want to be accused of stealing anyone's material, so I watched a few of them. But there's like 6 or 7 PMBoK 7th edition YouTube videos ranging from like 3 hours where they really go in depth to like 20 or 30 minutes of what it means. All good feedback, and some of which even helping me with this presentation. But there's YouTube videos on everything. You want to learn how to pick your front door if you lock yourself out, if you want to build something. So good point that we're more in a YouTube video graphical learning curve than we ever have been. Okay, so with the release of the 7th edition, we're seeing off the bat a shift in ideology. First, the 6th edition was the PMBoK standard and then the Agile practice guide. They didn't really morph together very well for those who, the few on Zoom and the 10 people here who actually read as 2 separate publications. Of PMBoK was more process orientated, waterfall heavy, and then you also have this agile practice guide. If you want to do agile or if you're doing agile projects, follow this, but it didn't gel. They fixed that with this edition. Although you do start off with their principle-based ideology and perspectives, it reads as one book. To limit the glossaries and indexes after every subsection, there's a glossary and index, so that makes it a little bit easier to page numbers and things when you're working off of the PDF, and I'm sure when you have the hardcover standard. So we've worked with knowledge areas. The 6th edition looked at those knowledge areas: cost, scope, schedule, risk, and really deep dove into those. With the 7th edition, we go from knowledge areas more to project management principles, which we'll go into in groupings here, but value, quality, leadership, characteristics that you as project managers and your project teams have to be successful. If you abide by those principles, not necessarily in a process oriented way, but keeping the principles in mind and having a checklist in your head of, am I doing these things? Your projects should lead to success. The 5-phase project that was the process areas or the sub-process, but initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, control, and closure. That was more of a linear process. On all my Microsoft project plans, I tried to keep to that linear process, but then you have monitoring and controlling dependencies that loop around, and you try to baseline and it won't baseline, and then your head explodes, and you're frustrated over 2 rows of information that aren't right, that are screwing everything up. But did it ever have to be linear? For the people in the room, raise your hand if you looked at those 5 phases as more of a linear top to bottom approach. Okay, getting some head nods. And I think that's how PMI wanted it. Every project is temporary in nature and has a start and an end. You had to start with initiating and have those requirements out of the gate in order to close it. So it made sense, but it did pose problematic. And as the federal government and the Fortune 500 companies go from more waterfall project management to doing project management via agile or hybrid or different ways, it's important that we kind of break out of that monotony of, well, the PMBoK says do it this way, so we have to do it this way. And that's how a lot of project and portfolio managers lead. That's what the guidance told them. Now the guidance tells them something else. So we've shifted from that 5-step linear process more to 8 project performance domains with a focus on measuring delivery. There's a lot of projects that may execute, but are they actually delivering anything substantial to the customer? Or that is still going to be in place 2 or 3 years from when the project team closes up. That there's more focus on that now. And with measurement, metrics, dashboards, we'll go into that a little bit through the presentation. And then you'll see that there's arrows from the 6th edition and the 7th edition pointing down to PMI Standards Plus. PMI Standards Plus is a digital platform. I'll go into the specifics of how you access it, how you should be using it, how it differs from projectmanagement.com, which many of you are familiar with. But essentially, there'll be guides, templates, case studies, frameworks that can set you up for success if you're still doing project management via the PMBoK 6-way, which is more waterfall and linear, or if you're adapting or that the standard caught up to how you're doing things with 7th edition. So we finally have that PMI hub of how to do things. I think projectmanagement.com was a good Band-Aid, but I could put a template for what my stakeholder management plan is on there, but it wasn't really PMI endorsed in terms of the products. So we'll get into that a little bit later. Feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation. We don't have to wait till the end. Any in the room? Okay. Okay, so a wise philosopher named Willy Wonka once said that you should never ever doubt what others are unsure about. There's not one Willy Wonka of PMI. Everyone's an elected board member. The CEO is chosen a little bit differently, but there's not one gospel factual way of doing project management. It's all interpretive. So keep that in mind with any standard of this nature. You can finish your projects, you can build your house literally or philosophically via many different ways. Okay, so we're going to go into the principle part of the 7th edition and this more principle-based ideology that they're adapting. Project management principles aren't prescriptive in nature. They're not intended to guide behaviors of people involved in your project. You can't say you will do this or you have to abide by this. That's not what they're intended for. And they were developed by a global community of project practitioners. The 10 pages of contributors, me not included, were from across the globe and all helped build this. This wasn't a C-suite delivered product. And that's the great thing about the PMBoK and why I think we've finally seen the revolutionary change now that we've seen little changes from versions 1 through 6, but I think now we're seeing a big sway and catching up into how 21st century projects are being worked and managed in 2021. The project management principles are going to overlap with general management principles. This isn't a new thought leadership way of looking at business life as a whole. You can create your own Venn diagrams in your head or in your office, but there is some overlap there, a lot of which will come logically. Okay, so one thing I did interpret just for the sake of slide crafting was put these principles in groups. That way it didn't have to be one for each slide. So these groupings are Lowy language and not PMBoK language. So the first is a real focus on team stewardship. In order to have good project teams where you're looked at as a project leader, or if you're in a project team role, you can look at the leader with respect and trust. I've been on plenty of projects where I second guessed the project manager or the program manager, and in your head, you're like, oh, I could do the job better. And that takes you down a rabbit hole that you're not 100% focused on the performance and what value you can add to the project. So important stewardship is good. I think over the last 5 to 10 years, servant leadership's been a big buzzword. Servant leadership isn't used in 7th edition, but stewardship kind of aligns with that. Your team, your project team's really the key to your success. For IT projects where you have engineers and cyber people, like they look at you as either for leadership and guidance or what value are you adding. So you need to always gain their buy-in. So keeping that team first mentality, and if you are in a leadership position within your project or program, really making sure that that team environment is conducive to success, that everyone feels that they're contributing, that their voice is valued, that they're not being taken advantage of via being made to work too much of the time. Those things are important to keep focused on. That don't take your project team for granted. And then your stakeholders. So the principle isn't saying write out a 8-tab Excel stakeholder matrix where you're putting impact and influence ratings and you have a RACI matrix and all that. All those are still good, and a lot of the time to answer the 5 W's, you're going to need stakeholder matrix. But this focuses more on serve your stakeholders, engage with them, make sure that they're getting updates when not when they ask for them, but on a reoccurring basis where they can depend on them, so they don't have to ask for them. With the federal government right now, they're looked at the commercial sector and said, I can automatically tell where my pizza is from Domino's or Papa John's at any given time? Is it in the oven? Is it in the car? Is it at my front door? Why can't I do that with these multi-million-dollar IT projects? And we don't have a good answer. So we're looking at SaaS platforms like ServiceNow and Salesforce and things that have those ready-made dashboards to put us in a position where we can keep stakeholders informed and be proactive and not reactive. Okay, there is 3 characteristics. So as luck would have it, the 12 principles easily fit into 4 groups of 3. So that was nice from a slide caption perspective too. So value, are you adding value? Are you adjusting the project to make sure you're continually adding value and knowing that value? This isn't earned value management, even though that could be a part of it, but more just a philosophy of, is what I'm doing adding value, or am I just doing it because the process says to do it? Complexity. Some projects are easy, some are really hard. Some you don't have all the answers at the onset. We'll talk about predictive approaches here in a little bit in terms of how you can forecast better. But some projects are going to be complex. Can you handle that? Are your project teams and the project structure developed to handle that complexity and to make complex projects easy to understand for both your stakeholders and your project team members? And adaptability and resiliency. Can you easily adapt when roadblocks and hurdles come? Can you be resilient if somebody on your project team quits, or if you thought your development epic was 130 user stories and then you get an extra 75 a week before you were supposed to go into user acceptance testing? Like those type of situations, can you adapt? And that's on the project manager. Some techniques that come out of the principle: system thinking. I think system thinking, machine learning, design thinking are big buzzwords right now. We look forward through our program content to give you more of a deep dive on those. But if you look at your project as in a system way and look at it more holistically on how everything has to work together for your project to be successful and to stay on schedule and under budget. It's just a new approach that PMI hasn't really pledged before, and I think a lot of us haven't really dove too deep into. Tailoring. Outside of just the principle, there's also like 11 pages on project tailoring, which is pretty interesting. And things, another concept and technique that PMI hasn't really gone through. A lot of us are familiar with minimal viable project for MVP. Like what's good enough? IOC and FOC for interim capability versus final. I think we're looking at things more of what's good enough for production and what's that final state. So you have to tailor your project outcomes to what's actually feasible. And if you are looking at things more agile and release to release, or not having everything up front, tailoring your projects is going to be important. And then change. Change management's been one of the keys to success for project management throughout its history. You can't be stuck in your ways. You have to be willing to adapt and embrace new technology. There's going to be some people who are going to look at the 7th edition as rubbish and say, no, we need that process. PMI was successful because they had that linear process. And without it, how can projects be successful? Some of you may have stakeholders that want to stick to waterfall, and they'll say, okay, we'll do agile, but they want a full integrated master schedule and want everything answered. That's not agile. You're still waterfall. And I think that's where hybrid comes in, but change is important. ProC's done a great job at offering change management certifications as well as frameworks. There's a lot of knowledge on change for you out there, to include the few pages in the 7th edition. But change adaptability and management's very important. And success keys, leadership. As stated before, project leadership is going to be instrumental to success. Some projects can run themselves. If you have subpar leaders, you can still get the output that you wanted, but did you make the people on your project team better? And did you really add value to the process as a whole? Quality. This isn't so much quality management in terms of auditing, but was your criteria for acceptance met? If it wasn't, what was done about it? Keeping that in mind of if you were to be audited, most audits and speaking as a certified quality auditor, more initials after my name, it's not so much did you follow one process, it's whatever process your company had, was it followed? So keeping that in mind as a principle is important. And then of course, risk. Risk management still present in the PMBoK, but it's not as process orientated and this is how risk is ran. We look forward to having Mr. Pritchard here later on this year, either virtually at a symposium or here in person, hopefully, to talk about the risk part of the 7th edition of the PMBoK and how risk is changing through the 21st century as we continue to embrace new technology and tools. From a show of hands, who actively uses the risk register in their projects? Okay, a little more than half. Okay, so those are the principles. They fit in a sentence. I took more of the keyword out of there, but focus on value, tailor based on content. So as you review the 7th edition, if you choose to, you'll be able to link the dots a little bit there. But the principles are going to guide the behaviors of the project performance domains. The domains are our new kind of less linear process. I think these domains can work concurrently. Of course, you can't execute or deliver something if you don't know what the scope is or have stakeholders. So there's some things that are still linear in nature, but that's how the principles relate to the domains, which is all new speak in the 7th edition. So the principles are going to guide the behavior of the domains. If you follow the principles, your work on the domains within your project teams and your projects will lean more towards being successful. Okay, so you start with stakeholder performance domain. As you look through the book, there'll be a domain description at the onset, and then anywhere from 5 to 15 pages of explanation as to the keys to success within that domain and different things that you can try. At the end, you'll have more of like a outcome checklist. So I've included that in each slide in its full entirety. So this is more, that's what you should be taking away, but there's not for each domain, like this Visio product of a process flow chart of how you should do it. It empowers you as the project manager of how you should interpret your stakeholders based on these important factors. So the biggest thing with stakeholders is to have that working relationship with them and to make sure that they are informed and they've been a part of the process the whole way through. That doesn't necessarily mean just feeding an email. At least at the federal government with Microsoft Teams, Slack's being used in some agencies and departments. And I think not having 75 to 100 emails a day so you can communicate is looked at as a goal across the board. Executives and senior leaders, high-ranking military officers just can't handle that degree of inbox burden and load. So communicating with your stakeholders via other ways, and that doesn't mean death by PowerPoint either. in terms of, well, I can't send emails, I'll have a meeting every day. That's not any better. So coming up with collaborative ways of, be it dashboards or Microsoft Teams, you can put in trackers and make that information readily available. So at any time ad hoc, stakeholders can be informed and they're not in the dark and they're not waiting for a meeting to come off mute and say, what's the status on this? So they can already know. Sure.
Just trying to understand, so in the PMBoK 6, right, there were these 49 or 50 processes that we need to understand.
Yep.
And stakeholder management was one of the 10 ones. So in the new PMBoK, have they just extended that, or how are they presenting? Are there still the 49 processes still there, but they're being improved on or enhanced to reflect reality to the extent that you have to be proactive or more informative or more engaged?
They're not there anymore in terms of this is a process that should be followed. A lot of what was in that process is taken and put in the glossary or the narrative of this is what it is, but you can decide on how to use it. Going back to the PMI standards plus digital offering, which will be a separate portal that you'll have access to. If you're in IT, if you're in healthcare IT, if you're in construction, if you're in financial management projects, you can filter down to those and actually see process maps of in those disciplines, what do the processes look like? Because I think the feedback they got from the more process oriented way of doing things was, well, my construction project doesn't really follow this. This is more like IT, or my software delivery doesn't really follow this. So how do I make it work? And then people made assumptions and either complicated the process or simplified it to the point where it wasn't effective. So they haven't scrapped it. That's why the 6th edition still points down to the standards plus, but they're, in my interpretation, setting things up for member success more than they did in the past. Of just saying, hey, here's the process, but if you have a square peg that's supposed to fit in that round hole process, well, good luck. There wasn't much help there. So now it's a little bit easier to understand and navigate.
Student who is studying for PMB, they need to understand the digital standards of this course.
Yep. For those who don't know, the project management professional exam changed in January. We don't have anyone here, maybe on Zoom, but not in the room, that has taken in the last 5 months. We have gotten some feedback from the 2020 changes, but the current, if you register to take the PMP today, it would still be based on the 6th edition. But they broke it down to more people and processes and business engagement versus as process heavy. So it wasn't to the point of you had to remember like all the math calculations and formulas and this step in the process. It was a little bit more logical. And I'll have a slide to cover that in a bit, but my expectation for when the exam is based on the 7th edition will be more how project management's done outside of processes and more like how you make that work in a multiple choice for people with different experiences. I think that'll be the challenge. So, yep. Okay. So with the principles, we clearly delineated that stakeholders and teams are different. So this team performance is more your project team and the deliverables and output that they do. That all of it's not on one person. You have shared ownership, that it is a high performing team. You're getting the most out of every member. You as the project leader or program leader are identifying people's strengths and weaknesses of where they can most contribute to the project, and not just, well, I'll put 4 people here and 5 people there. And through your project leadership, that you're influencing the team value. Emotional intelligence is brought into the 7th edition through this team performance domain description. We've had presentations on EQ. emotional intelligence in the past couple of years, another buzzword that means different things to different people, but more being aware of everything around you, both your project team's feelings, how you conduct your meetings, just being emotionally aware and emotionally intelligent as a leader or as a project team influencer will have success keys throughout your project. Development approach and lifecycle performance, that gets a little more interpretive, but how you're going to develop, if it's an IT project, the software that you're developing, what does that look like? And then more identifying the life cycle of, if it's an agile project, how are things released? How's that being communicated? Those are being spoke of here. I think we're in the federal government, we're moving more towards government-led, contractor-supported, vendor-supported software development. Instead of just paying that integrator $10 or $20 million a year to do all the development work, and the government core or technical POC or babysitter just sits in the meetings and nods their head and maybe injects value, that we're actually getting development out of our enlisted and officer military personnel and our civil servants and government workers, that they're actually becoming software developers, not just providing oversight to it. So I think that strengthens the workforce, and we're seeing that a lot, at least within the Air Force and the Navy. So more, how are things developed, and then what's the plan for delivery? Delivery has its own performance domain, but in terms of keeping that in mind, so going back more to this can be worked concurrently, you're always going to have a key on development delivery, but as you have things delivered, you may not be in a position that you can go back and change things or course correct. So there's still some linear influence here, but it's not as top down as it was prior. Okay, and then the development approaches. So we talked about waterfall and the resistance to change. The 7th edition really goes into 4 main approaches for development. Predictive, which is more when you have all those requirements and all the questions answered at the start of the project, where you can manage more in a waterfall mentality. By a show of hands and a Zoom yes or no, how many people's projects within the past 2 or 3 years have fallen in that predictive definition? Not too many, at least here. Okay. And then adaptive approaches, when the requirements are uncertain and subject to high levels of change throughout the project. So you know you have more questions than answers at that point, which is okay. And then from a hybrid perspective, they break down hybrid projects, which small form agile heavy, but still some waterfall considerations, and iterative and incremental. Iterative is when the requirements are being clarified throughout. So if a minimal viable product is your goal, like that MVP of, okay, we may have 300 user stories for this agile development project, but only 75 are MVP. Let's go. Yes. Okay. And then just a little tech check there. And then from an incremental hybrid, that's when deliverables are produced through iterative releases. So that's more traditional agile of every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks, we're going to release these new features. So it goes into more detail with process maps of things. The one that I liked the best was next slide. And that hybrid development versus iterative versus incremental. So you can see on the process map that through the iterative, you're taking that feedback, you're continuing to adapt. You're still on whiteboards, you're still working your Kanban board for traditional agile project management, but you're learning as you're going, and that's influencing your releases. With incremental, you basically have your releases already mapped out. Okay, planning. So before, under the 5 process model, planning was second. Now you see planning as fourth. Same, pretty much overall plan approach of what are your outcomes, how are you going to spend your time, how are you going to use your project members, those type of expectations. But you're doing all that other work up front. You're figuring out what your releases are going to look like, what your delivery looks like. And then based on that, it's easier to plan. So I think that's how a lot of projects are done. You may have some of the planning at a 5,000 foot level done, but until you really get in the weeds and map things out a little bit, you can't plan for the success that you probably need until you have more answers or more stakeholder buy-in. Okay, project work performance. This kind of falls into execution, but they've extended the execution out to delivery as well. So this is the output from your project performance, the management of the resources, like what you're actually spending your money on, and what that looks like, how you're handling change. So instead of executing, look at it as work. When you're actually doing the work. When I made more waterfall, like IMS project schedules, deciding what was planning and what was execution was always kind of a slippery slope for me. So I was like, well, this is planning, but it's actually like real activities and could be execution. And like, I mean, there wasn't anybody to say one way or another, but that was, as a project manager, one of my burdens in terms of what constitutes planning, what constitutes execution under the old model. Okay, measurement. So we talk a lot about metrics. We talk a lot about metrics that matter. That's what leaders want to see. That's why the ServiceNow is the Salesforce. They're so dashboard heavy with their out of the box offerings, that where you are on the iron triangle is clearly evident and accessible. And with that information, it's easier to make leadership decisions, or decisions if you do need to course correct, because you have all that performance data and data analytics available to you. Okay, so not all measurements have to be something that are very in the weeds and data driven. A mood board is offered as an example of a measurement where you're not waiting for a post-project 360-degree assessment, that you're assessing your project team's mood on a daily basis. Are they happy? I think in these COVID times, assessing that virtually is sometimes harder because you're not seeing that body language or getting that everyday touch point. So it's important as a project leader to at least have that understanding. You should be in a position where you could fill out a mood board as a separate artifact for yourself. And then as we enter the 21st century, dashboards, instead of briefing from PowerPoint slides, brief your projects live from whatever solution you're using. If you are using a platform, a license-based platform like a Salesforce or ServiceNow or a Oracle HCM Cloud or OutSystems, like brief from where the data is going instead of just taking this data and then jamming into PowerPoint. And agile user story points. in the 6th edition, they weren't talking about user stories that much or burn up charts or how do you know how much more work you have to do if you don't know how quickly your teams are developing on story points. If they're only knocking out 120 per sprint and to stay on schedule, you need them to be at 200. Like you need to know that as it's going on, not at the end of 3 or 4 months. That's your job as a project leader, from my interpretation, to keep tabs on that throughout. So always looking at measurement, not just as earned value or your scheduled performance index, as we've learned in prior PMBoK guidance, which is still important. I still use SPIs on my project, but using the tools that are available to us through modern technology. Okay, uncertainty. This is where risk more goes in. They're not so much calling it a risk domain, but it's more uncertainty, because uncertainty expands upon risk of what are all the questions you don't have answers to yet, and what are the negative impacts that can come as a result. Okay, so those are all the performance domains. So when you look at those versus the 5 process model, you could come out of this with, well, I'm still a little lost. How do I use this to help my daily efforts? And I look at what they've done with the 7th edition as more of a reference and a guide that to enlighten your own perspectives and kind of create your own way, but still having that standards plus portal of which to get templates and processes if you want. But if you keep the 12 principles and the 8 performance domains in mind as you work, and I'm sure as they come out with more artifacts from this, there'll be performance domain checklists and things of that nature. But it's not so much just you have to do it this way anymore. From a show of hands and a yes, no on Zoom, do you think this is more conducive to project success, or that you're going to be missing that kind of process guidance that you've had prior to? Those who think this is better? Okay, a little more than half. Those who think that the 6th edition wasn't broke, so why'd they fix it? Okay, a few. Okay. Okay, great. So, yep, most people in chat are better. So it's Ms. Lee, if you want to put your question in chat, we'll be able to read it off there. So for our virtual attendees, thank you for sticking with us. And any questions that you have, feel free to put it in chat, and we'll have our trusty moderator read them off. Okay, what I was really excited about when I got to this section was that there's a lot of models and methods, but it's not, this is the PMI way of doing things, or these people gave money to PMI, so we're going to give them credit. Basically, like every model that's been published of professional business and leadership is in here with at least a paragraph. So situational leadership, Oscar, ADKAR for change, the Tuckman ladder, Daniel Pink's model. Daniel Pink spoke at our 2018 symposium. This is his first appearance in the PMBoK. The McClellan needs, Herzberg. So it doesn't map out step by step of how the models work, but it gives enough explanation for you to do a little bit more research and find out more about it. But I like that they're looking at more, how's the industry doing things? What business models have been taken by our project management global community to be used, which the 10 pages of contributors, myself not included, was it contributed a lot of these models. Oh, for change management, I use this. And that made it into the publication. So that's exciting for me that we're not like this. If you're not doing it the PMI way, you're doing it wrong. That there's many ways to get many things done, and they're pointing people in the right direction for those. And then as you look at the performance domain, it may have been a little bit unclear. You're like, well, how do I actually do that? They've provided tables where for each model, communication and for motivation, for change, out of the performance domains, where do those fit? So this kind of helps you build your process as you go through. So when you figure out what works for you, what works for your project, you can look through this and say, okay, for planning, I can pick one of these. Like, let me look through or understand them or ask my team who has expertise, who's used a Techman ladder before for team building and development. So it guides you that way, but it's not the start to finish process. It's more built for those who remember the Choose Your Own Adventure books from the 80s and early 90s. It kind of delves you down that way. And then methods for each performance domain. For the sake of time, I can deep dive into every method, but you'll see that's where you see your root cause analysis, your SWOT analysis, your earned value, all the formulas that you had to remember to pass the test in prior years. So all that is available to you. And I think that's fun as we kind of use this as a reference and a tool in our tool bag of how to better get value out of our projects. Okay, I talked about PMI Standards Plus. So this is free to PMI members. It's on the PMI.org. There's a subdomain of Standards Plus in front of it. You have to register separately. So you'll log in with your PMI.org account or just go here directly, and then you have to click on register, log in again. But then you have access to all the standards and guides. You have the case studies. As I mentioned before, you can filter whatever type of project management you're doing. There's like a list of 20 checkboxes. So if you're in software development, you're not looking at what works for just general like IT or network delivery from a process perspective. So that's where you'll get more help. I look at this as not an alternative to projectmanagement.com, which many of us use. You watch a webinar or you click start, you walk away, you come back at the end of 50 minutes and hey, you have a PDU, which a lot of people use projectmanagement.com for, which is fine. I have at times as well. But those templates are like, this worked for me, I created this, I'll upload it, but it's not PMI endorsed or even PMI validated. Like there's no checks and balances to put something out there. If it is, it's very like thin and not very conducive. Everything in Standards Plus has been looked at from the PMI Global team of professionals who are like, yes, this makes sense. So I think Standards Plus is going to be maybe the most powerful tool that PMI is given outside of the actual body of knowledge itself. Okay, what's the impact on the test? So in January 21, they changed the PMP test again to more focus on 3 domain areas: people, process, and business environment. So process is still big. So on the test, still you have to remember, you know, this comes before that and those type of multiple choice questions. That'll be, but the exam also became very agile and hybrid approach heavy, that everything wasn't as waterfall as it was. I took mine in 2015. Some people may have taken it prior to that, some people after. The exam outline has been just as important as a review as the actual version 6, because version 6 came out in 2017 and they've had 3 releases or 3 changes to the exam since then. So that exam outline was either more important or as important as the actual 6th edition. And then over the course of the last year with the pandemic, they've offered that online practice exam where you have to have the webcam to show your entire desk or dining room table. And if you talk to yourself, they'll potentially suspend your exam because they don't know if you're talking to somebody else. So if you haven't done an online practice exam in the comfort of your own home, it's a fun experience. When it just shuts down midway through and there's no one to talk to or get it back on and you have to retake it like a week later, like that sucks. But at least you're not, you know, being monitored on camera, like when you're at the facilities and like you can't go to the bathroom and like they only let you drink a little bit of water. So both approaches are good. We are expecting a PMP update and possibly other exams based on the 7th edition changing curriculum that you've seen. That'll come in 22 or 23. There haven't been any declarative dates for that yet. I'd be interested to see what the exam looks like based on the principles and performance domains versus the old processes. Like, is there still any math? What's the test look like? But I do believe that the 7th edition mirrors how project management is being done in 2021. So can they mimic the PMP test to be based on how it's actually being done? Can that be done in a test environment? We'll find out, but I'm sure there's smart people on the case for that. Okay, so what do you do now? So I'd recommend just download it, add it to whatever your file repository is, OneDrive, Google Drive, something that if you're stuck in a doctor's office and you have your phone on you, you can just kind of scroll up and down. As I mentioned, it's a good reference for different things, especially the models and methods of how to learn more and learn different ways of doing things that you've always done. I'd recommend continue to lead and manage projects as you have. A change in the PMBoK isn't going to impact that. For some project managers, they don't even know what the PMBoK is, but they're still managing successful projects. Use as a reference and tool, and then with the models and the methods, maybe pick one or two out of the list and see how they can add value to your work. I think a lot of these frameworks and different approaches are good if they're done how they were intended, meaning like put the work in, don't try to take any shortcuts from the steps and see what you get out of it. Of course, you wouldn't do a model or a method for all of them for any given project because the project will never be done. But just maybe if as you either listened to this presentation and chose to embrace the 7th edition or said, I'm not going to get much value out of this, if you did want to embrace it, then looking at that methods and models, I think would be the biggest takeaway. Okay, any questions from anyone?
This will be online. We can download.
Yep. So as I don't have a consulting company or anything that would make me want to PDF my work, the PowerPoint will be available for those who have downloaded your PMBoK in the past. It's password protected with your PMI account password. So even if I put mine out there, then I have to share the password, and then Mr. Geis would get a nasty gram that one of his officers was violating protocols. So, but everyone here, I believe, is a valid member. So if you have time, go to PMI.org, download the guide. You'll have the slides as a loose cliff note navigator. And we look forward to continuing to dive more into this from a detailed perspective of the performance domains and the principles, and map our program curriculum to those type of things. Not so much, here's somebody else's interpretation of the PMBoK, but more if we can get Carl Pritchard to talk about how risk has changed from the 6th edition to the 7th edition, what he looks like as the keys to risk management in 2021 with all these different development approaches, having that talk lined up for the principles of stewardship, having a stewardship talk. So you'll see these words again, just not so much in this is a change to a 370-page book, but more like why was this a change and how can it help you and add value? Is I think work in 2021 is not so much what you've done in the past, what letters and acronyms are behind your name, but how are you delivering and how are you adding value? And if you're doing those two things, you're on the right track. If you're not, you probably need to hop on the bus and do them. So if no questions, thank you for your time. I hope I earned the privilege of your time, and happy PMBoK reading. Oh, one question. Yep. So the question was for those who are looking to take the PMP exam this year, what edition should they be focused on? They should still be focusing on the 6th edition. We do have 20 members who have taken the 2021 test. So I'd recommend if you have someone on your staff who is looking to take the test, reach out to us, and we'll put you in touch with somebody or a group of people who can hop on a Zoom call with your staff member or yourself and kind of walk through what they studied for, what they saw versus what they studied for and didn't see on the exam. Okay. And for closing remarks, I'll turn it over to our president, Mr. Charlie Geis.
Matt, I think you did a great job. I think it was easy to follow. I think it was content that was worthwhile. So thank you very much. Great job. We're planning to continue monthly PMI meetings here for the rest of the year. So that's our plan. Thank you. Our next meeting will be September 1st. And other than that, I just want everybody to drive carefully and get home safe. That's it.